Tonight we slip into the folds of the fog where ancient hands once pressed butter into the bog like a secret, and where the earth very patiently kept it safe for 3,000 years. You kneel beside a patch of damp moss breath, clouding in the evening chill. The bog stretches around you in every direction, quiet, spongy, and humming with unseen life. Midges buzz at your ears. The air smells of wet wool, crumbling peat, and something else. Something sour. Your fingers press into the earth. There's resistance. Then a give. You pull up a clump of something pale waxy and very much not a stone. It's butter, bug butter, roughly 3,000 years old, soft, cold, and strangely proud of itself. Unless, of course, your nose can survive 3,000-year-old cheese with boundary issues, in which case, welcome. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always amazed how many of you tune in from under duvets at 2:47 a.m. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You study the lump in your hands. It's cold, but not frozen. Crumbly, but not dry. It smells faintly of sour cream oil and something decidedly committed to staying uneaten. Bog butter has been found across Ireland and Scotland for decades, often by turf cutters who strike something soft mid-slice, only to uncover a tub barrel bladder or tightly knotted cloth bundle filled with ancient fat. It ranges in size from small lunch lumps to 100-pound barrels, and in age from a few hundred years old to over 3 millennia. A mainstream fact: peat bogs are near-perfect preservation chambers, cool, acidic, low in oxygen. They halt decomposition, arrest bacteria, and slowly tan anything they touch. They've preserved butter bodies, wood grain, and the occasional forgotten shoe. Which raises the question, why put butter in a bog? Some say it was practical, a way to chill dairy before refrigeration. Others argue it was ritual, a sacred offering to gods, spirits, or the other world. Some theories suggest it was insurance, a hidden food stash buried to avoid raiders or taxes. Historians still argue whether bog butter was meant to be retrieved or left forever. A quirky tidbit in medieval Ireland, butter wasn't just food, it was currency. Rents, taxes, even social obligations could be settled in tubs of butter. To bury butter might mean storing wealth, preserving tribute, or sealing a vow. You press your thumb into the lump. It leaves a shallow print. There's something deeply odd about this, about touching the intentions of someone long gone. Did they pack this with care? Did they kneel like you, whispering thanks or fear into the mist? Did they expect to see it again? The bog doesn't answer, but it does remember. You wrap the lump in cloth and tuck it back where you found it, patting the moss like closing a book. The peat accepts it, or keeps it, and somewhere beneath your knees, thousands more lumps may still lie waiting, stubborn and quietly preserved by the soggiest magic of all. You step back from the mossy, hollow hands, still tingling slightly from where they held the cold, waxy lump. You can't quite decide whether you're reverent or mildly disgusted, but either way, you're intrigued. What exactly is bog butter? It's a question archaeologists, chefs, folklorists, and one very confused dog have asked for centuries. Bog butter, in the simplest terms, is butter or animal fat that was deliberately buried in a peat bog. Sometimes it's dairy-based, churned and salted or unsalted. Sometimes it's tallow rendered from animal fat, more like medieval lard than a breakfast spread. Either way, it's been buried in the spongy peat for decades, or more often centuries. And the result? A substance that's sort of still butter, but now smells like wet wool iron, faintly rotten apples, and occasionally antique beef jerky. Not exactly spreadable, not exactly edible, but certainly memorable. You recall one famous find from 2016 in County Meath, Ireland. A turf cutter unearthed a 22-pound barrel of bog butter dated to about 2,000 years old. He did what any practical man would do. He gently passed it off to the National Museum of Ireland after his neighbor tried to taste it. Here's your mainstream fact. Most bog butter finds date from the Iron Age through the Middle Ages. Some are about 300 years old. Others clock in at nearly 500. And they've been found across Ireland and Scotland, often during peat cutting, hidden just below the surface in wooden tubs, carved bowls, or animal hides, sealed with turf and tied up like a sad, greasy Christmas present. The look and feel varies. Some bog butters are still soft and creamy, especially if wrapped in airtight containers. Others are dry, cracked, almost crumbly like old soap or fossilized cheese. A few are near rock-solid. Archaeologists have mistaken them for bog wood, only realizing they were butter when someone took a cautious sniff and regretted everything. A quirky tidbit: in one case, a lump of bog butter was discovered inside a hollowed-out tree trunk, carefully plugged at both ends with turf. It was so well sealed, the butter was still squishable. Modern researchers sliced a sliver, sniffed deeply, and quickly backed away. They described the scent as damp sheep toasted sourdough and something faintly angry. Delightful. The chemistry is fascinating too. The bog's low oxygen content halts microbial decay, while the acidity tans the fats, preserving them like ancient leather. The process is not unlike what happens with bog bodies, but instead of turning you into archaeology's most famous mummy, it just gives you dairy with opinions. And yet the question remains, why? Why go to the trouble of churning milk, sealing it up, trekking into the marsh, and burying it? Was it just Iron Age refrigeration? Or did something more spiritual lie beneath? Historians still debate this. Some point to evidence that suggests seasonal storage, that butter was buried during warm months to keep it cool, then retrieved when needed. Others argue that some deposits were never meant to be dug up, offered instead to gods or spirits, part of a broader ritual landscape that includes bog offerings, weapon burials, and human sacrifice. In other words, your butter might be lunch, or it might be a prayer. You picture a wooden keg tied with leather cord, half filled with salted dairy, and lowered into a peat pit beside a boundary stone. Someone whispers. Someone turns away without looking back. And the bog, as always, holds its secrets. But not all secrets stay buried. Modern researchers, brave or foolish, have begun experimenting with recreating bog butter. In 2012, Irish archaeologist Daniel C. O'Mahony made his own. He buried freshly churned butter in a cow's stomach, wrapped in bark, and left it in a peat bog for several months. When he dug it up, he reported it was edible, smelled odd, tasted intense, but edible. More recently, chefs have collaborated with historians to sample small amounts of ancient butter. Reactions vary from smoky, earthy, compelling to deeply unpleasant, but oddly nostalgic. No one's quite sure what the nostalgia is for. Possibly death. You take a last look at the place where you reburied your own find. The moss has settled, as if nothing ever happened. But your nose remembers, and your hand, still faintly greasy, carries the echo of something that shouldn't exist, but does. And that perhaps is the magic of bog butter. It's food, it's mystery, it's survival. And somewhere between the churn and the burial, it became a whisper from the past, soft as moss and weird as cheese, that's waited too long. You move slowly now, stepping lightly across the bog as mist curls low around your boots, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and distant wood smoke. Beneath your feet, the ground squelches not deep, but just enough to remind you you're walking on something halfway between soil and memory. This isn't just land. This is a peat land, a place that forgets nothing. And that's where the bog butter's real magic begins. Because what makes this odd ancient dairy last for thousands of years is not a spell or a blessing or the cow's impressive work ethic, it's chemistry. Peatlands are cold, wet, acidic, and oxygen-poor, exactly the opposite of your average refrigerator, and yet somehow just as effective. Let's break that down gently as the fog thickens, and a heron croaks somewhere just out of sight. First, oxygen, or rather the lack of it. Peat bogs are anaerobic. Once something is buried beneath the surface, be it butter a barrel or an unfortunate cow, it's sealed off from air. Without oxygen, most bacteria and fungi that cause decomposition can't survive. The same goes for insects. No flies, no beetles, just very slow, very chilly waiting. Second, acidity. Peat is made of partially decayed plant matter, mostly sphagnum moss. This moss releases humic and fulvic acids, which tan organic material much like leather. That's why bog bodies often emerge with leathery skin and preserved organs but no bones. The acidity eats the calcium right out of them. And third, temperature. In Northern Europe, peat bogs are cold. Not frozen, but cool enough to slow down biological processes. It's like nature's version of store in a cool, dry place, except it comes with fog and midges and the occasional 3,000-year-old snack. A mainstream fact researchers studying bog butter samples have found that many are chemically stable, with fat profiles still recognizable as dairy even millennia later. They use lipid analysis identifying fatty acid residues that match cow's milk, sheep's milk, or even mixed animal sources, which leads to a wonderful lingering question. Who buried this? And how did they expect to get it back? Because peat doesn't just preserve it, hides. There are bog butter lumps that have been found less than a foot beneath the surface, sitting quietly for centuries. Others are discovered at the bottom of peat stacks 10 feet deep. only emerging after decades of fuel harvesting. And in nearly every case, there's no marker, no map, no rune-inscribed butter flag, just hope and soggy memory. This is where scholars start debating. Some say bog butter was deliberately buried with the intention of retrieval, a kind of Iron Age larder. Others argue that the depth and lack of markings suggest ritual deposition meant not for human recovery, but as an offering to the gods, the land, or the ancestors. You picture a quiet figure digging with a wooden spade, the barrel clutched in their arms, a prayer on their lips. Maybe it's an offering for good harvests. Maybe it's a thank you. Maybe it's a bribe. Because the bog isn't just a refrigerator, it's a threshold. In many Celtic and Northern European belief systems, bogs, marshes, and wetlands were seen as liminal spaces where the human world blurred with the divine, the wild, and the dead. A quirky tidbit alongside bog butter. Archaeologists have found weapons, jewelry, tools, wooden idols, and even human remains. One site contained a butter barrel next to a spearhead and a pair of woven sandals. Was it someone's lunch? Their last offering? A funeral gift? Nobody knows, and Peat doesn't gossip. But the preservation isn't perfect. While many samples emerge intact, some come up half-melted crumbly or disturbingly translucent. Their smell varies too, some rich and earthy, others sharp, acrid, or oddly sweet. There's no consistency. Each one is its own tiny chemical memoir. You stop to rest on a stone. The moss around it is cool and damp. Somewhere beneath it, who knows what might be waiting, cheese-bone bronze or a story that hasn't yet finished aging. You press your hand to the ground. It gives just a little, like it's listening, because the bog doesn't preserve in a vacuum. It remembers in layers. The butter is just the beginning. Underneath it might lie the handprint of the one who buried it, or a child's footprint fossilized beside a tub, or a twig doll left as a charm. Every inch of this soggy land is a stratigraphy of meaning, and the butter, soft and golden and sour, sits somewhere in the middle of it all. A whisper, a flavor, a question. You rise from the mossy stone and move slowly along the edge of the bog, your boots sinking just enough to make you pay attention to every step. The light has softened into that pale gold evening hue, where everything looks like it's been brushed with milk. You're starting to see how in a world without coins or clocks or central heating, butter could be the answer to almost anything. Tonight we follow it not as food, but as fortune. Because in ancient Ireland and parts of Scotland, butter was wealth. Not metaphorically, not romantically, literally. In a world where cows meant status and fat meant survival, butter was a gold standard. It was given as rent. It was offered as tribute. It was sent as a gift between kings and abbots and bards. And when someone buried a large, glistening tub of it in the bog, that wasn't wasteful. That was putting your money where the moss is. A mainstream fact in medieval Irish legal texts, especially the Brecon Law's butter, appears constantly. It's listed as acceptable payment for land fines, debts, and even hospitality obligations. One law specifies that a guest denied butter during a stay had legal grounds for offense. Imagine storming out of a friend's house because they didn't butter your bread, and being right, it didn't stop there. Butter was also offered in tribute to local chieftains passed between monastic communities and sometimes used to curry favor pun, extremely intended with neighbors' kin or angry gods. There's even a 12th century Irish tale where a tribe settles a boundary dispute by sending 12 tubs of butter into enemy territory and burying them. Scholars still argue whether that was a gesture of peace, a warning, or just a passive-aggressive way to ruin someone's pasture. The point is, butter wasn't just survival food. It was currency diplomacy and social glue, and it was heavy, which is why sometimes people didn't carry it far. They hid it. In cool earth, in the back corner of a thatched shed, or most enduringly, in the bog. It's hard to imagine now in a world of foil-wrapped blocks and plastic tubs. But a well-made tub of butter wrapped in hide, smeared with salt or not, was a precious commodity. Burying it wasn't a whim. It was storage strategy, and sometimes sanctity. You imagine a family with a single cow. They churn the milk by hand, singing old songs in the smoke of the hearth. It takes hours, days, maybe more. When the butter finally comes together, it's golden soft and rich with labor. It goes into a wooden keg carved from yew or alder, lined with leaves. The top is sealed with wax or bark or turf. Then it's tied, blessed, and walked to the edge of the bog. You kneel again, picturing the hands that pressed it into the ground. Did they bury it to keep it cool until the festival? To keep it safe from raiders? To offer it to something just beneath the surface? Here's a quirky tidbit in some oral traditions. Butter buried in the bog could be retrieved only if you remembered the exact spot and said the correct charm. One tale warns of a man who lost his family's butter keg, wandered the moor for weeks, and only found it again when he offered a coin, a sprig of rowan, and the final line of a forgotten song. Did he get his butter back? Hard to say. But the bog kept the coin. You reach into your pack and pull out a small modern tin of butter, yellow, smooth, almost unnaturally tidy. You open it, sniff, and smile. It's fine, but it doesn't smell like intent. The butter of old carried stories: who made it, who gave it, who waited for it to return. When it was buried, it wasn't discarded. It was entrusted. And that's why so much of it still shows up today. In barrels, in bladders, in cloth sacks, often next to boundary stones or crossroads, or the edges of property lines, places of transition, both physical and spiritual. Historians still debate whether these deposits were practical caches meant to be dug up for winter feasts or hard times, or if they were offerings left for God's ancestors, or the unknowable things that breathed through mist and moss. Perhaps they were both. A family might bury 2 kegs, one to feed and one to bless, one to nourish the body, and one to keep the world in balance. The bog, as always, held both. You rise your hand, brushing the moss again. Somewhere beneath it, you sense the weight of countless gifts, soft, fatty treasures buried with care and wrapped in belief. The evening deepens. And somewhere behind you, the ground exhales. You walk the edge of the bog now, feet pressing into soft turf with every step, and the air grows wetter, thicker, like it's been aged in barrels right alongside the butter. You pass low brambles, patches of sphagnum moss that bounce slightly underfoot, and the occasional warning croak of a toad tucked into a soggy corner of the world. You're wondering about the people, about the hands that buried all these kegs and bundles and barrels. How did they do it? What were the rituals? Was it casual, ceremonial, or something that lived in between? Tonight you learn how to bury butter like a Celt. It starts in the home. You imagine a small hut, stone walls, a thatched roof streaked dark from rain, and the smoky tang of peat fire wafting out the door. Inside, a woman churns. Her arms are tired, her hair tied back, her elbows slick with the splash of cream turned to curds. A wooden dash thumps inside a barrel like a heartbeat. The butter rises. They scoop it out by hand. Press it into a bladder, a cloth, or a carved tub. Sometimes it's packed into birch bark or sealed in with layers of moss and clay. Sometimes there's salt, sometimes not. Depends on the season. Depends on the cow. Depends on whether the butter's for eating or not coming back. A mainstream fact: many bog butter finds come in wooden vessels, expertly coopered barrels, small carved bowls, or simple staved tubs. Others are found inside animal bladders, stomachs, or skins, tied tight with sinew or bark cord. The goal: seal it. Keep air out. Make sure it rests like a treasure. And then the walk. Out across the moor. The bog squelches under their feet. Maybe they come alone. Maybe in a group. Some deposits are small, one handful, a wrapped lump. Others are massive, over 100 pounds of churned fat in a keg the size of a sheepdog. They choose their spot. Not random, never random. Usually on a boundary or near a trackway. Somewhere in between. A place where the veil thins. Sometimes near water. Sometimes at a crossroads. Often nowhere visible at all. They dig with a wooden spade, or sometimes just their hands. The hole doesn't need to be deep. 1 or 2 feet of peat is enough to start the magic. They press the vessel down, covering it gently, carefully, like tucking in a child or sealing a promise. And sometimes they leave a marker, a stone, a tuft of hair, a bent twig stuck upright like an arrow. But more often they don't, because part of the act is trust, or forgetting, or offering. A quirky tidbit: some bog butter vessels are wrapped in plant matter leaves, bark, or woven rushes. One even came out packed inside a knot of tree roots, suggesting someone used the forest's own work to guard their stash. In one case, the wrapping seemed more elaborate than the butter itself. Historians still debate whether this was purely about preservation or if it was a kind of ritual layering designed to spiritually seal the butter from decay, theft, or unwelcome consumption by things that don't quite qualify as human. You crouch at the edge of a real peat cut now, a vertical wall of dark, wet layers. It's like time stacked up in slices, each foot a different century. Somewhere in there, 3 inches deep, a butter bundle. No marker, just silence. Because bog butter isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when it's found, it always feels like a mistake, even if it isn't. The people who buried it may not have intended for anyone to find it. Or maybe they hoped someone would, a future kin, a hungry stranger, a curious traveler like you. Some modern discoveries still bear the marks of care-carved handles, decorative rims, stitched seams in the hide. One Irish butter lump was wrapped in a double layer of sheepskin fur side in as if to swaddle it. Another had faint finger marks in the lid. 3 impressions. Parallel. Pressed down firmly. Deliberately. Maybe it was a sign. Maybe it was a signature. Maybe someone said, "This is mine," or yours, or the gods. And then they walked away. You kneel beside the bog again, touch the ground with your palm. It's damp and springy. The moss sighs under your hand. You could bury something here. You could whisper into the peat and let it swallow your words. The bog would hold them. Not forever, maybe, but long enough. Long enough to forget. Long enough to remember. You open your coat, take out your own wrapped bit of butter, just modern stuff, salted, cold. But you press it into the peat anyway, just for a moment, just to feel the weight of ritual. And when you lift it again, there's a little smear of moss clinging to the cloth, like a thank you, like a nod, like maybe, just maybe, the bog accepts. You walk back toward firmer ground, the bog behind you, now quiet, vast and still quietly judging your butter handling. The mist hangs lower than before, and in the far distance a bird calls once, then goes silent. And now we arrive at the brave, the bold, and the questionably wise. The ones who sniffed the bog butter, and the ones who tasted it. Yes, tasted. Because as soon as people started digging up these ancient dairy relics, someone inevitably had to ask, "But what does it smell like?" Followed closely by, "And if we licked it hypothetically, would we die?" The answer, blessedly, is no. Probably. Let's start with the smell. Bog butter has been described in various ways over the years. Some say it smells earthy, musty, like old cheese wrapped in moss. Others get more poetic, smoked meat with a lactic tang, a ghost of buttermilk, or a pungent whisper of forgotten Christmas ham. A mainstream fact, most bog butter is chemically altered after centuries underground. It's not butter in the modern sense. The fats oxidize and break down. The texture shifts. The smell becomes interpretive. One archaeologist described it as soft tallow marinated in compost and distant regret. And yet, people taste it anyway. In 2012, Irish researchers working with chefs and food historians decided to make their own bog butter for science. They churned fresh cream, packed it into a cow's stomach, buried it in a peat bog, and left it for 3 months. The result: a firm, slightly waxy slab with a rich, smoky flavor and an undeniable sense that you were eating history. And possibly someone's childhood. A quirky tidbit when they tasted it. Yes, they did. They described the flavor as gamey blue cheese meets smoked meat with a mineral afterglow. Not entirely unpleasant, not entirely inviting, definitely something you eat with your eyes closed and a deeply optimistic heart. Since then, a few modern chefs and food adventurers have followed suit, some burying butter for months, others for a full year. One YouTuber, whose channel name is appropriately a pun involving rot, described the experience as butter if it went to a cave rave and came back with emotional damage. You pause beside a heather-cloaked stump. The moss has gathered at its base like a blanket. You wonder what's under it. A bone comb, a lost blade, or maybe a modest bladder of bog butter, still patiently waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to taste history. But the modern taste tests don't stop at imitation. Some researchers have very carefully tasted actual ancient samples with gloves, microscopes, and courage, just tiny flecks. Enough to identify the richness, the waxiness, the preservation. And yes, some were still edible. But don't get ideas. These are controlled lab environments, not your next camping snack. Historians still argue whether Iron Age people meant to age the butter or simply keep it cold. Was the bog meant to ferment it, to flavor it? Or did that just happen as a side effect, like cheese in a boot left too long beside the fire? There's evidence that in some cultures, aged or smoked butter was preferred, stronger, funkier, more nutritious in winter. Some researchers believe the bog may have acted like a giant outdoor pantry, slow curing butter, the same way you'd age meat or harden clay. It's possible they liked the flavor. It's also possible they just got used to it. You remember your own school lunch once, cheese that had sat a little too long in your bag wrapped in wax paper, humming faintly with ambition. And you realize we're not so different from our ancestors. We forget the butter in our bags. They buried theirs in a bog. Same energy. You sit now at the edge of a small, shallow cut where a barrel was once pulled out by peat harvesters. There's still a dent in the moss. You breathe in the scent, peat smoke, old grass, maybe even a hint of sour cream memory. Somewhere out there, another tub still waits, sealed in wood or hide, packed with stories. Maybe still soft to the touch, maybe still sharp to the nose. And someone someday will open it. They'll peer inside, sniff cautiously, and then say the words that have launched 1,000 regrets. I wonder if it's still good. The bog fog curls tighter now, threading between the trees like a lazy cat. Somewhere off to the left, something splashes a deer, a trick of the wind, or maybe just a waterlogged root losing its grip on the present. You don't flinch. You're deep in the peatlands now. Nothing is urgent here, not even time. And as you pace the moss, you start to wonder, were all these butter bundles meant to be found again? Or did some of them go into the ground with the full knowledge they'd never come back? That, dear listener, is the soft heart of one of bog butter's oldest mysteries. Why did they bury it? And what did they expect? Was it always practical, just a way to keep the butter cold, safe, and untaxed? Or were some of these dairy deposits rituals in disguise, offerings, sacrifices, silent bargains with something old and watching from beneath the surface? Historians still argue. And Peat doesn't tell. Some archaeologists point to the containers, well-crafted, lidded, sealed with care. Surely, they say, that implies intent to retrieve. Butter as storage. bogs as refrigerators. Simple. But others counter that many finds come from deep bogs, unmarked sites, or dangerous terrain with no reasonable path for future collection. These weren't caches. They were gifts. A mainstream fact ritual depositions in bogs were common across Iron Age Europe. People buried weapons, jewelry, tools, animals, and even humans in wetlands, especially in liminal spaces, borders, trackways, places between villages and wilderness. So when butter shows up alongside these offerings, well, you start to suspect it wasn't just about lunch. You crouch beside another shallow cut in the turf. Someone once found a butter keg here, packed in bark and tied with leather cord. When archaeologists opened it, the butter inside was still soft, slightly golden, and resting like it was waiting to be judged. No one ever claimed it. And it sat near an ancient wooden idol carved into a stylized human figure with hollowed-out eyes and a broad, sad grin. That figure, too, was buried deep in the peat, standing upright like it had walked partway into the bog and then changed its mind. Together, they whispered something older than food. A quirky tidbit: some ancient peoples believed the bog was a portal to the other world, a place of spirits, gods, and dead ancestors. Anything buried there wasn't just hidden. It was given. Like a letter folded into the earth, carried downstream by soil and silence. Some butter deposits show signs of ceremonial wrapping herbs tucked into the cloth or symbols carved into the wood. One had a tiny comb laid across the top. Another had a coin pressed into the lid. Coin and butter, payment and gift, or perhaps bribe and blessing. You picture the old woman again, hair braided, hands calloused. She carries the bundle with care. She stops at the bog's edge. She doesn't bury it quickly. She hums. She presses a kiss to the lid. She whispers a name, or maybe a wish, then lowers it slowly like it might wake. That wasn't storage. That was prayer. Historians still haven't reached consensus, and maybe they never will. But modern excavations increasingly recognize these deposits as part of a larger sacred landscape rituals woven into daily life, where survival belief and butter blurred together like mist at dusk. And even if some lumps were meant to be retrieved, many weren't. They were left with intention, hidden not from thieves or raiders, but from those who shouldn't see them. Perhaps spirits, perhaps gods, perhaps rival clans, perhaps even time itself. You sit again, the peat soft beneath you. You open your hand and imagine placing something precious into the ground, not to save it, but to surrender it. What would you give? What would you let go of if the bog promised to keep it safe? Because that's the strange comfort of this landscape. Everything disappears here, and nothing is lost. The fog thickens again, drifting in low curtains that catch on branches and ripple gently across the bog's open skin. You sit still, listening to the hush. It's not silence, never silence, but a kind of soft symphony. Distant water bubbles, reeds whisper, and something winged rustles overhead unseen. It's easy to see why people once thought spirits lived here. And it's just as easy to believe they were right. Because tonight, we step deeper beyond storage, beyond tax, beyond even ceremony, into a realm of bog butter that may not have been for people at all. It may have been for them, the others, the fair folk, the good neighbors, the she, call them what you like. But across Celtic and northern folklore, bogs have always been places of thinness, where the barrier between the living world and something other wears down like boot leather. A mainstream fact, countless traditions link bogs, moors, and wetlands with the supernatural. Offerings were often made at the edges of these places. Coins, milk, cloth, silver rings, and yes, sometimes butter. Gifts to ward off illness, misfortune, bad harvests. Gifts to appease something watching. And bog butter may well have been an edible offering. You imagine a woman standing in the dusk, her child coughing inside the sky gone sour with storm. She churns in silence. No herbs this time. No salt. Just cream and prayer and fear. She bundles it in cloth, wraps it tight, and carries it into the peat. Not to preserve it, to give it away, because the spirits must be fed too. A quirky tidbit in Irish folklore butter was especially vulnerable to fairy interference. Churns would fail mysteriously. Cream would sour. In some tales, a woman would churn all day and find nothing but foam until she burned herbs beneath the barrel and muttered an old name. Only then would the butter come. Sometimes it was even considered dangerous to look too closely at your butter if you'd churned alone at night. You might see something watching through the smoke, or worse, realize someone else had churned it with you, so burying it might have been insurance. Historians still debate how literally we should take these stories. Was the butter really for fairies? Or were the fairies just the face we gave to chaos, bad weather, crop failure, famine, unexplained illness? Maybe both. But we do know that milk and butter were sacred. First milking of the season, poured out as libation. Butter at a wedding, symbol of abundance. A guest without butter, an insult. An enemy without butter. A curse. And in some regions, bog butter wasn't just hidden, it was sung over. Low lullabies passed down from older women, words that don't survive on paper, but echo in the peat. A hum as the packet was lowered into the moss. A final pat of the ground. Then silence. You kneel beside a shallow pool, now water black and mirror smooth. You think of all the soft bundles below your feet meant not to be found, not to be eaten, but to be accepted. Because bogs were never just landscape. They were thresholds. And butter was never just food. It was a message. Sometimes a plea, sometimes a bribe. Sometimes a way to say, please don't take the child this year. You recall one tale from Donegal, where a woman buried butter every solstice in the same spot by the water. When asked why, she said, so they remember who we are, and leave the doors closed. The bog's surface trembles slightly. A breeze, maybe. Or maybe something moved. You smile. You're not here to understand everything, just to listen. And in the world of bog butter, listening is half the spell. So you press your hand to the ground one more time, not to plant something, not to take something, just to offer the oldest gesture of all, acknowledgement. You rise from the edge of the pool, hands cool from touching moss, breath puffing little clouds into the evening air. It's darker now, just enough that you can't quite tell what's bog and what's sky. But the ground beneath you stays solid, spongy, steady. And strange as it sounds, it almost feels like you're walking on the shoulders of stories. And in this next story, butter isn't the only thing the bog remembers, because it turns out the peatlands preserve people too. So tonight you meet the other famous bog dwellers. The ones who, like the butter, ended up underground for reasons no one fully agrees on. Welcome to the strange parallel world of bog bodies. You've probably heard of them, those remarkably preserved Iron Age individuals found in peat bogs across northern Europe. Their skin dark and tanned, their hair still clinging to their skulls, their fingerprints sometimes visible, and sometimes their lunch. A mainstream fact, several bog bodies have been found within walking distance of butter barrels. In Ireland, Denmark, and Scotland, archaeologists have uncovered both human remains and butter bundles from the same bogs, and in rare cases within the same strata, meaning they were buried around the same time. Coincidence? Possibly, but also possibly not. Some believe bog bodies were ritual sacrifices kings, criminals, or unlucky strangers offered to the gods to secure harvests or calm unrest. Others argue they were executions, punishments, or accidental deaths in treacherous terrain. The debate continues. But what makes the connection eerie is this: both bog butter and bog bodies were buried with care. Not thrown, not hidden, placed. You kneel beside a shallow depression in the moss. Archaeologists once found a young man here, body curled, eyes closed, arms folded across his chest. He'd been killed deliberately. Neck broken, clothes neatly tucked beneath him, and near his body, a wooden keg, still sealed, still filled with butter. Historians still argue whether the two were connected: a single ritual, a funeral offering, a symbolic act. Was the butter for him, for the gods, for the land? Or was it there to balance the scales? A quirky tidbit in some traditions, human sacrifice was accompanied by offerings of food and wealth. Gold grain and, yes, fat. Butter was seen as the essence of the cow, the sun-stored gift of the land. To bury it with a person was to say, "This soul is valuable. This death is meaningful." Other finds are less direct, but still haunting. A bog body in Denmark was found with a last meal of porridge in their stomach. Porridge spiced with berries and seeds, carefully prepared. Nearby, in the same bog, a sack of animal fat. Possibly a separate act. Possibly the same ritual split across space. The bog doesn't clarify, it just holds. And here's something to consider. Both bog butter and bog bodies survive because of the same chemistry. The cold, the acid, the lack of oxygen. They lie side by side beneath the surface dairy, and flesh bone, and fat intention and accident. One becomes an exhibit in a glass case, the other a sample in a freezer. But both are remembered, and both somehow are still communicating. You walk now across the soft rise of another peat mound. It smells like wet earth and rain-soaked iron. Beneath you, you know without question there are stories, some in barrels, some in bone. Maybe that's why the idea of eating bog butter unsettles people, because it's not just old dairy, it's too close to memory, too close to ritual, too close to a face, a voice, a burial not meant for digestion. You pause at a place where moss has recently been cut away, a square of open peat. No butter, no bodies. But the ground feels expectant. You whisper into the earth, "Thank you for what you've kept, for what you've hidden, for what you've softened." And you step back into the dark. Because out here, every lump of fat, every curled hand, every carved keg, and every sealed smile is just another page in the soggy, sacred diary of the bog. You walk now along a raised trackway, an ancient one made of split logs and flattened stones, threading through the marsh like a forgotten spine. It feels deliberate beneath your feet. Steady. This was someone's route, once maybe a trader, a herder, or a monk with a sack of scrolls and a wedge of strong cheese, but more likely someone delivering butter. Because in the Old North, butter wasn't just a snack or an offering. It was how you paid rent. Tonight, we follow the story of butter as currency, a creamy, slow-churned economy that greased the wheels of power from the thatched cottage to the chieftain's hall. A mainstream fact in early medieval Ireland and Scotland, butter was an official form of tribute. Alongside cattle wool, honey, and dried fish, butter could be used to pay rent taxes and fines. In some regions, it was the preferred method. Why? Because butter meant you had cows. Cows meant land. Land meant wealth. And unlike a live cow, butter didn't kick, run, or need to be fed. It could be wrapped, weighed, stored, or buried if things got tense. Under the Brecon laws of Ireland, an intricate set of native legal codes, punishments, fees, and even honor prices were often measured in set, a unit that could be paid in butter. One law even specified the amount of butter owed to a poet if they were insulted publicly. Imagine getting into an argument and settling it with a 3-pound tub of soft dairy diplomacy. You picture it now, a tenant, tired and muddy, trudging across a bog road like this one, carrying a wooden bucket filled with butter. Maybe 2, maybe 10. He's late. The Lord's expecting payment, and he prays the bog doesn't swallow the path or the butter. Here's a quirky tidbit in some legends: butter debt led to curses. One tale tells of a woman who withheld the agreed tribute, one small tub of golden summer butter, and whose cows went dry, her daughter took ill, and her butter turned black in the churn. Moral: always pay the butter tax. But not all rent was owed to lords. Some went to monasteries, especially in early Christian Ireland, where monks maintained storehouses of butter that functioned as both food and fuel. Yes, fuel. Butter lamps were used to light sacred texts, provide warmth, and occasionally ignite more dramatic punishments, One monk reportedly excommunicated a thief by smearing a holy book with stolen butter and then setting it alight. And if you couldn't pay your butter dues, some buried it. Historians still argue about this one. Was buried butter always intentional payment delayed? Or was it emergency storage, hide it before the tax man comes knocking? Or maybe a little of both, the butter equivalent of stuffing coins under your mattress during hard times. One particular find in Fermanagh, Ireland, revealed over 100 pounds of butter buried in a keg lined with woven bark. No nearby home, no markings, just butter resting in its wooden womb, a storage stash, a ritual tithe, a rent payment that missed its collection date by roughly 900 years. You reach into your own pack, find the small tin you tucked away earlier. It's not ancient, not special, just butter. But you imagine pressing it into the moss not as a gift, but as a deposit. Maybe to settle a debt with someone unseen. Or just to remind the world you owed. You paid, you walk on, you walk. The trackway disappears beneath bracken, but you know you're not far from the next village. If this were 900 years ago, that is. You imagine arriving with your bundle, handing it over to a steward who weighed it, sniffed it, and judged your churn with cold, practiced eyes. You've added bog mint again, he says. You nod. It keeps well. He grunts. You still owe half a tub. Rent wasn't always fair, but it was binding. And butter was its own kind of truth. Soft, dense, rich with labor, a product of care, patience, and the fragile line between abundance and hunger. You didn't churn it fast. You didn't hand it over lightly. Butter meant you worked. You waited. You survived. And when it left your hands, it told the whole story. You glance back toward the bog behind you, the trackway now swallowed by fog. And you know that somewhere buried in its folds are the records of 1,000 transactions not scratched on parchment, but pressed into tubs and barrels, salted or not sealed with moss and paid with a whisper. Rent is due. The bog remembers. You leave the ghost of the trackway behind and follow a narrow path lined with bog myrtle and wind-whipped heather. The ground rises slightly drier here, with firmer turf underfoot. In the distance, a low stone wall crumbles into the moor. This was a farm once, or part of one, its stones hauled by hand, its history mostly lost. But not quite. Because just over that rise in 2004, a farmer cutting peat found something odd in the dark, a wooden bucket. Solid. Lidded. Heavy. He pulled it from the peat, expecting firewood, or maybe some old rubbish. What he got was 22 pounds of butter, 300 years old, yellow as beeswax, cold as myth. Cold. Tonight we dig into the real archaeological finds, the actual lumps, tubs, and bog butter barrels unearthed by turf cutters, farmers, and one particularly alarmed dog. And as you'll see, the soggy north has no shortage of surprises. A mainstream fact, dozens of bog butter deposits have been discovered in Ireland and Scotland over the last century, most by accident. Someone swings a turf spade. It hits something soft. They dig, and suddenly they're holding history in their hands, and sometimes on their shoes. Let's start with the big ones. In 2009, a 3,000-year-old 100-pound barrel of bog butter was discovered in County Kildare, Ireland. That's nearly 45 kilograms, roughly the weight of a teenage sheep. The barrel was intact, staved with iron hoops, buried with care, and still filled to the rim. The butter inside creamy, yellow, slightly waxy, smelled faintly of old memories. In 2013, a similar find surfaced in County Offaly. Another wooden vessel dated to the early Iron Age. When they opened it, the butter had hardened into something cheese-like, but chemically still dairy. The National Museum of Ireland took possession. No one tried to taste that one. But not all the finds are barrels. Some are wrapped in animal hide, carefully tied, sealed with turf and compressed into strange, misshapen bundles. In 2016, a 22-pound lump was pulled from the peat in Emlag bog encased in a cow's stomach. Local reports said it smelled ancient. It's always interesting when something smells like a year. Some are even more unexpected. In Scotland's Highlands, one peat cutter found a butter bundle inside a carved wooden bowl, half-rotted, still holding faint impressions of a spoon. Another find came with a shard of wool pressed into the lid, possibly a piece of clothing used to seal or mark the vessel. And in one particularly vivid case, a dog named Buster unearthed a butterball near an old farm track in County Donegal. He rolled in it, joyfully. He was reportedly proud for hours. The archaeologists less so. Here's a quirky tidbit. Not all bog butter was necessarily for food. Some lumps tested by researchers contain tallow-rendered fat, more suited for lamp oil or waterproofing than cooking. One theory suggests some of the bog deposits were used to make saddle grease soap or even ointments. But even when not edible, the care is clear. Lids were carved, handles added. In one case, the maker burned a small mark into the side of the barrel, possibly a maker's rune, possibly just a squiggle from a hot stick. But either way, a message from the past. Some historians believe these finds may have been part of seasonal food cycles: churn in spring, bury in summer, retrieve in winter. Others argue they were tribute stores meant for gatherings, festivals, or feasts. Still others suspect ritual. We may never know for certain. But when you lift one of those kegs, cool, slick, wrapped in centuries, it's impossible not to wonder about the person who buried it, what they hoped, what they feared, whether they thought someone would find it someday, or if they hoped no one ever would. You pause now beside a long peat bank, the kind still cut for winter fuel. The wind has picked up, brushing through heather and reed. You feel the earth breathing beneath your boots. There could be a barrel here. There could be a bundle. There could be nothing. That's the joy of bog butter archaeology. It's a history that hides. And when it appears, it does so unexpectedly, and usually a bit smelly, but always respectfully. Because when you pull a tub of ancient butter from the ground, you're not just digging up lunch. You're holding a decision, a memory, a moment someone thought was worth preserving in peat. And maybe deep down you're a little grateful they did. You follow a winding sheep path, now damp underfoot, with tufts of heather brushing your legs, and the sweet, almost smoky scent of peat curling up into the mist. The bog is quieter here, less of a place to cut fuel or find barrels, more a place where stories sink into the moss. And what stories they are. Because long before butter was sealed in barrels and dropped into the peat, it lived in songs, spells, and superstition. Tonight, we drift into the world of butter in lore, where cows made miracles churns were cursed, and the fair folk had a suspiciously consistent appetite for dairy. A mainstream fact across Gaelic folklore, and even some Norse tales, butter wasn't just food. It was power. People believed that how you made, stored, shared, or even looked at butter could bring prosperity or misfortune. Let's begin at the churn. To churn butter in the old way was an act of rhythm and time. You poured the milk, set the lid, and began to move the dash stick up and down. It could take hours. You could sing to it. You could pray over it. And according to just about every grandmother from Kerry to Caithness, you never churned alone at dusk. That was fairy time, a quiet hour when the boundary between worlds thinned and someone else might want to share. Stories abound of butter that wouldn't set milk, that wouldn't turn cream, that went bitter in the churn until the woman would strike a red-hot iron across the barrel or whisper a charm under her breath. Some said that if your butter kept failing, it meant someone had stolen your luck, or your neighbor had placed a charm in your barn. A quirky tidbit, one traditional counter-curse involved burning a piece of cloth soaked in the failed butter while chanting a verse that roughly translates to, "If you stole my luck, take the smoke and go with it." Butter appears everywhere in old stories. As a wedding gift placed under the threshold to ensure fertility. As a ward rubbed on the horns of cows to keep them from being hexed. Even as a divination tool where the shape of the curds could predict illness or weather. And it wasn't just witches and fairies you had to watch out for. Butter was considered so valuable, some people were buried with it, not always as food, but as a charm. One old tale from County Clare speaks of a butter pat sealed in a clay jar and placed inside a coffin to soften the journey. Historians still debate the literal truth of these rituals, but the stories persist, and the line between belief and behavior was always soft, especially when your winter survival depended on a cow, a churn, and a bit of luck. You pause beside a low stone circle, mostly sunken now, just 5 moss-covered slabs poking up from the earth like lost teeth. It could be anything, an old animal pen, a marker for something older. You reach down and touch the lichen. And you remember another story. This one from the Hebrides, where a woman once claimed her butter had been taken by a hag in the night. No footprints, no marks. Just an empty tub. The local priest offered her no help, so she marched to the bog and buried a scoop of lard wrapped in nettles. A week later, her butter returned, churned fresh, with a perfect yellow curl and a faint smell of brine. Coincidence? The peat remembers, but it doesn't explain. One of the most curious beliefs was that bog butter glowed in the dark. Several old tales mention butter that shimmered faintly when pulled from the earth, usually just before something else went terribly wrong. Wiser voices said it was a sign to leave it be. That glowing butter wasn't for you. It belonged to the land, or the spirits, or whatever walked between them. You sit back, wrap your cloak tighter, and watch the bog breathe. Somewhere beneath your feet, There's a lump of dairy sealed by hands long gone. Maybe it was a tithe. Maybe it was a trick. Maybe it was just someone's way of making sure the butter didn't vanish again. But something about it feels like a message. A prayer pressed into fat and moss. A charm you were never meant to read. But now you have. And still the butter waits. The wind sharpens now, just a little curling through the heather, like a tongue whispering half-remembered words. You wrap your cloak tighter, the bog sprawling behind you like a great breathing hide, soaked with stories and salted milk. And just over the next ridge, you spot them. Sails. Not full ones, not white. Just carved impressions, embroidered edges, and runes still clinging to the timbers of long-forgotten hulls. The Norsemen were here. And tonight we wonder what happened when Vikings met the butter. A mainstream fact: Norse raiders, settlers, and traders arrived in Ireland and Scotland between the 8th and 11th centuries, establishing outposts, trading ports, and sometimes burning monasteries for fun, and books, and cows, and probably breakfast. As they moved inland, they would have encountered the same moors and marshes we walk tonight, and buried just below the surface, the same butter barrels. What would they have thought they weren't strangers to butter? In fact, Norse societies placed high value on animal fats for cooking for lamp fuel, and especially for preservation. Their own bogs back in Scandinavia turned up occasional caches of tallow and meat. One saga even mentions butter packed in bark-lined troughs aboard ships used to soften hard bread on long journeys. So when the Norse cracked open a mossy keg and found a 3-year-aged clump of Irish cream, maybe they shrugged. Maybe they sniffed it, poked it, tasted it, and said, "Not bad, bit soft, let's steal it." There's no written record of a Viking butter raid, but we do know they looted dairies. Monasteries in Ireland kept detailed accounts of cow's cream and cheese given as tribute. Norse raiders sometimes demanded butter as part of negotiated peace payments, alongside silver and hostages. A quirky tidbit: one Norse-Irish hybrid king, Imar Ua Imair, reportedly held both Viking sea power and deep land holdings in butter-rich regions. His taxes included butter shipments, which means at least one warlord likely kept a butter accountant. But the Norse weren't just raiders. They settled. They married locals, raised sheep, built barns, and perhaps most importantly, adopted the bog. Not just for peat fuel, but for its uncanny preservation. Later, Norse settlements in Scotland and Orkney show signs of bog storage pits, where meat, cheese, and butter were likely buried or chilled, using the natural coolness of turf and moss. Historians still debate how much Norse custom influenced bog butter use, or vice versa. Did the Irish teach Vikings to seal bladders of dairy in peat? Or did Scandinavian settlers adapt their own methods to a softer, wetter land? You sit on a flat stone now, wind tugging at your hood, and imagine the meeting. An Irish farmer trudging home from the moor, arms full of damp peat and something suspiciously fatty. A Norse trader watching, squinting, then nodding. "Hide your butter in the ground, Can I try if you pay first?" Trade begins. Cultures mix. And deep beneath it all, the butter waits. Somewhere in the Orkney Islands, archaeologists found bog-tanned leather fragments near a Viking-era settlement. The chemical signature rich in dairy fats. Possibly the remnants of a butter pouch. Possibly just a misbehaving lunch. But the overlap is there, peat preservation, and the strange shared logic of food and fear. And perhaps the butter meant different things to each. To the Irish, tribute ritual survival. To the Norse, food ballast, or soft-spoken wealth. But both agreed on one thing: burying it worked. The peat kept secrets for everyone. You lean back now and close your eyes. You picture a Norse warrior sitting beside an Irish farmer, each eating rough bread smeared with something cold and moss-kissed. Neither one speaks, but they nod. Because the bog doesn't care where you come from, only that you leave something worth remembering. You rest now in the shadow of a stone wall half swallowed by moss, the sky above you deepening into indigo. The bog is quiet, not still but quiet in that rich, ancient way. The way that makes you feel like you're being watched by something older than people and possibly hungrier. Which makes it the perfect time to ask, what if you ate it? Not the story, not the memory, the butter. Because yes, modern humans with modern noses and YouTube channels and questionable curiosity have tasted bog butter. Tonight we swirl our spoon into the strange world of ancient dairy taste tests. A mainstream fact over the last few decades, a handful of brave or lightly unhinged archaeologists, food historians, and experimental chefs have attempted to recreate and taste bog butter. Some even sample tiny flecks of the real thing under controlled conditions gloves on historians wincing nearby. In one notable case, Irish food historian Kevin Thornton tasted actual bog butter during a documented dig. He described it as deep, gamey peaty with a long, earthy finish, and then with a dramatic pause added, not something I'd spread on toast, but not unpleasant. Others disagree. A Norwegian archaeologist tasting a one-year bog-aged replica made from sheep's milk simply winced and said, "It tastes like cheese that's been thinking about meat." A quirky tidbit in 2012. A team buried modern butter in a cow's stomach, yes, again, left it for a year in a bog, and served it at a food symposium. Chefs described it as rich and smoky with notes of wet soil candle wax and faint despair. One said it tastes like Viking sadness in a good way. Which brings us to the modern experiments. Recreated bog butter using traditional churns, salt-free cream, and proper cow parts has been successfully aged in peat bogs for months or years. The results are startling. Some emerge beautifully preserved with buttery texture intact, and a flavor somewhere between cultured cheese and campfire. Others emerge, less blessed. One turned entirely black. Another separated into an oily crust and a waxy core. One brave researcher described their sample as surprisingly edible if you enjoy licking wet barn walls. Historians still debate whether ancient people liked bog-aged butter or simply tolerated it. There's no clear evidence that people preferred the flavor, but there's also no reason to believe they didn't. In an age without refrigeration, flavor was flexible, and as one folklorist put it, taste changes faster than ritual, meaning even if they didn't love the tangy funk of 3-month-aged bog butter, they might have eaten it anyway. Or more tantalizing, they might not have eaten it at all. They might have made it for others, for guests, for feasts, for offerings, for bragging rights. like a wine cellar you never open but always mention. You pull your own modern butter tin from your bag again. Crack the lid. Give it a sniff. It's fine. It's safe. It's bland. And you find yourself wondering just a little what it would be like to taste a version of this that's been sleeping under peat for 3,000 years. Not a whole spoonful, just a flake, a whisper, a smudge on the edge of a horn spoon. Would it be sharp, sweet, rotten? Would it taste like smoke or sweat or ghost milk? Would you know the difference between ritual and rot? And if you did eat it, what then? Would something happen? Would something old stir? Or would you simply nod and say, tastes like history? Because bog butter, when you really think about it, is edible time. And sometime, no matter how long it's waited, wants to be tasted. You stand now at the edge of the bog boot's damp cloak, heavy with the breath of moss and dusk. The sky is bruised with stars. A low fog creeps in again, soft as milk poured over stone. You turn back toward the heart of the wetland, where somewhere beneath the surface the last lump of butter might still be waiting. No one knows how many are down there. Barrels, bladders, wooden bowls, buried for tribute, buried for storage, buried and forgotten. 1,000 small stories pressed into the dark like dreams wrapped in bark. And maybe, just maybe, you're walking over one now. You crouch beside a patch of sphagnum, soft and glistening. It smells of cold tea and crushed leaves. A good hiding spot if you needed one. But you've brought no butter tonight, just the quiet. And it whispers. Because bog butter doesn't just tell us about dairy. It tells us about people, the ones who lived close to the land, who measured time in churns and prayers, who knew that food was never just food. It was favor. It was fortune. It was a message sent downward. A mainstream fact, many bog butter finds are still unrecorded, dug up, discarded, sometimes even reburied by peat cutters who don't want the trouble. Others rest untouched, marked only in oral tradition. There's one out by the standing stone. My great-uncle found a lump the size of a lamb. It glowed in the moonlight, so we left it alone. Somewhere beneath the moss and mist they wait. They are not hungry. They are not cold. They are held. You press your hand into the earth one last time. It feels cool, alive, full. And you know you could come back tomorrow, next year, a century from now, and the butter would still be here. The bog is hushed now, blanketed in low fog and the faint shimmer of frost. The stars above are soft and silver, scattered like runes across the sky, and the land around you hums with a silence so deep it feels like breath held for centuries. Somewhere far below, a wooden tub lies buried. It rests in peat the color of tea, tucked in a hollow, dug by careful hands, wrapped in bark or hide or hope. The butter inside is quiet now. It has nothing left to prove. You walk the edge of the moss one last time. The ground gives gently beneath your boots. Every step is a whisper. Every squelch is a story pressed deeper into the dark. Behind you, the bog stretches on vast, unbothered eternal. It holds what it was given, Sometimes it returns it, sometimes not. And tonight it has offered a glimpse, a scent, a memory wrapped in salt and soil and waiting. You breathe in the cold air tinged with turf smoke and the distant memory of dairy. A faint wind brushes your cheek, soft as old wool. Somewhere a frog chirps. Somewhere else a rune fades. You are small here, but not forgotten. Because in this moss-wrapped, mist-cloaked corner of the world, even butter becomes sacred. And what is sacred is kept.